It's November 2022. FTX, the world's second-largest crypto exchange, has just vaporized, dragging the entire market into hell. Every financial institution on Earth, from the IMF to the World Bank, is screaming the same thing. El Salvador is insolvent. The experiment is dead. President Nayib Bukele stares at a loss of nearly $60 million. The national debt is spiking. The bonds are tanking. His political opponents are sharpening their knives. At that exact moment of maximum pain, with the country's credit rating downgraded to junk, the president pulls out his phone. He opens Twitter, and he types a message that would either save his nation's soul or ignite the fire that burns the Treasury to the ground. But he didn't sell. He didn't apologize. Instead, he did the one thing that no economist on earth could explain. Before the tweets, before the laser eyes, and before the global headlines, El Salvador wasn't known for financial innovation. It was known for bodies. For decades, this tiny strip of land was the undisputed murder capital of the world. Gangs didn't just operate here, they governed. MS-13 and Barrio 18 carved the map into fiefdoms of extortion and terror, but while the violence bled the streets, a silent, invisible killer was bleeding the economy. The country was in a straitjacket. Since 2001, El Salvador had committed the ultimate sovereign sin. It surrendered its own currency. They adopted the U.S. dollar. This meant that while the Federal Reserve in Washington could print its way out of a crisis, El Salvador had to beg. They had no monetary lever to pull, no printer to fire up. Their entire financial destiny was decided in a foreign capital 3,000 miles away. Worse, the system was rigged against the people trying to survive it. 70% of the population didn't have a bank account. They were ghosts in the financial machine. To survive, they relied on remittances, cash sent home from relatives working in the United States. But to get that money, they had to pay a toll. Predatory intermediaries like Western Union were siphoning off hundreds of millions of dollars annually in fees, money that was being stolen from the plates of the poorest families in the hemisphere. If you think it's criminal that banks take a cut of money sent to feed families, hit that like button right now. Enter Nayib Bukele. He wasn't your typical politician in a stiff suit. He wore a backward baseball cap. Fired cabinet members on Twitter and branded himself the coolest dictator in the world. He swept into power with a terrifying mandate: clean up the streets at any cost. And he did. He threw thousands into mega prisons, shattering the gang's grip on power. The murder rate plummeted. The streets went quiet. But safety doesn't fill empty stomachs. Bukele knew that crushing the gangs was only half the war. The real enemy was the economic stranglehold of the U.S. dollar and the slow death of a debt-trapped nation. He needed a way to bypass the global banking system entirely. He needed an exit strategy that didn't involve the IMF's permission. He was looking for a weapon, something asymmetrical, something that could level the playing field against the most powerful financial empires on Earth. He didn't find it in a boardroom. But he didn't find it in a frantic call with Wall Street. He found it in a place nobody was looking. Down on the coast, in a forgotten, dusty surfing village called El Zonte, a group of locals had been running a secret economic experiment under the nose of the government. They weren't using dollars. They weren't using banks. They were using a strange, invisible code that had washed up on their shores inside a mysterious USB stick. And what Bukele saw happening in that village terrified the banking elite. Because it actually worked. El Zonte wasn't on any investor's radar. It was a grid of dirt roads and tin roofs where cash was king because credit simply didn't exist. But in 2019, a ghost entered the machine. An anonymous benefactor, identity still shielded by layers of encryption, reached out to the village with a proposition that sounded less like humanitarian aid and more like a psychological experiment. This shadow figure had recovered a forgotten wallet loaded with digital currency and offered to inject the capital into the town. But there was a catch, a strict rule that would kill most projects before they started. The villagers were forbidden from converting the funds back into fiat currency. They couldn't run back to the safety of the paper dollar. They had to keep the value trapped in the digital realm, creating a circular economy. It should have collapsed. Without an off-ramp to traditional money, the experiment was designed to suffocate. But when the dust settled, the impossible was happening on the street corners. You had grandmothers who had never stepped foot inside a bank scanning QR codes to sell pupusas. You had teenagers paying for haircuts with a currency that no government could print, freeze, or confiscate. The transactions were instant, settling in milliseconds over the Lightning Network, moving faster than a wire transfer and costing less than a fraction of a cent. It was a closed loop of pure value, completely invisible to the watchful eyes of the global financial centurions. When word reached the presidential palace, Bukele didn't see a quirky tourist attraction. He saw a blueprint for insurrection. He realized that if a handful of surfers and farmers could successfully bypass the global banking cartel, a sovereign state could do it on a nuclear scale. He saw the ultimate escape hatch from the remittance giants bleeding his people dry. If he could scale this model, he wouldn't just be modernizing the economy, he would be weaponizing it. But to do it, he couldn't just whisper about it. He had to scream it. June 2021, Miami. The atmosphere inside the convention center was tense, a cathedral of speculation filled with the faithful. But nobody in that room knew the magnitude of the storm that was about to make landfall. Bukele appeared on the giant screen, looming over the crowd. Most analysts expected a generic promise, maybe a tax break for crypto companies, maybe a research committee to explore the technology. Instead, the president looked the world dead in the eye and declared war on the status quo. He wasn't just suggesting an alternative. He was holding a piece of legislation that would compel every merchant, every bank, and every business in his country to accept the one asset the establishment hated the most. He was pressing the launch button on a financial singularity, unaware that by the time the sun rose on launch day, the technology itself would turn against him. Jack Mallers, a 27-year-old hoodie-wearing CEO, paced the stage in Miami like a man carrying the weight of a geopolitical bomb. He wasn't pitching a product, he was trembling. Tears streamed down his face as he spoke about financial apartheid and the chains of the remittance system. Then, the screen behind him flickered to life, and the president of El Salvador dropped the hammer. Legal tender. The phrase tore through the auditorium like a shockwave. This wasn't a pilot program or a regulatory sandbox. Bukele was elevating a digital ghost, born in the dark corners of the internet, to the same legal standing as the United States dollar. The crowd erupted into a frenzy of euphoria, witnessing what they believed was the first domino in the fall of the central banking empire. But inside the marble corridors of Washington and Geneva, the mood was funereal. The International Monetary Fund didn't send a congratulatory note. They issued a warning. The World Bank slammed the door shut, refusing to assist with the implementation. They knew what this meant. If a sovereign nation could exit the dollar standard and survive, the hegemony was over. They weren't just watching a risky policy. They were watching a contagion. Bukele didn't flinch. He doubled down. He passed the Bitcoin law with a terrifying clause, Article 7. It mandated that every economic agent, from the largest hotel chains to the smallest street vendors, must accept Bitcoin if offered. To grease the wheels, he prepared a massive injection of liquidity, the Chivo wallet. Every single citizen with an ID would receive $30 in Bitcoin, a significant sum in a country where the minimum wage struggles to clear a few hundred a month. It was an audacious bribe to onboard an entire population overnight. The government feverishly installed hundreds of ATMs, preparing to onboard millions of users in a single 24-hour window. The stakes were absolute. If the technology worked, El Salvador would leapfrog a century of financial development. If it failed, the economy would grind to a halt, and Bukele would be exposed as a reckless gambler playing with his people's livelihoods. September 7th arrived. The Bitcoin Day. The eyes of the entire financial world were locked on San Salvador. Wall Street shorters were hovering over the sell button, waiting for a sign of weakness. The global press was camped out, ready to broadcast the disaster. At 12:01 a.m., the app stores were supposed to light up. The citizens were ready to claim their money. The president was ready to take his victory lap. But as the sun rose and the clock struck 8 a.m., the digital infrastructure didn't just buckle under the pressure, it vanished. The servers went dark, the download links dead-ended, and instead of a financial revolution, the country woke up to a blank screen. The silence of the servers was immediately replaced by the roar of the streets. As engineers scrambled to resuscitate the Chivo network, the market predators smelled blood in the water. They didn't care about software bugs. They cared about weakness. Within hours, a 10% flash crash in Bitcoin wiped millions off the country's economy before lunch. In San Salvador, confusion turned into combustion. Crowds gathered, not to download the app but to destroy the machines. Molotov cocktails flew. The sleek new Bitcoin ATMs, symbols of the future, were engulfed in flames. The opposition seized the narrative. The president had gambled the people's rent money on a casino game, and the House was already collecting. Most leaders would have retreated. They would have held a press conference, blamed a contractor, and paused the rollout. Buchel grabbed his phone. With the chart glowing red and the Treasury bleeding, he didn't issue an apology. He issued a trade. He bypassed the bureaucracy, bypassed the central bank protocols, and announced to the world that he was buying the dip. He was catching a falling knife with the National Treasury, betting that the panic was temporary. But the panic wasn't temporary. It was the prelude to a winter that would freeze the country to the bone. Fast forward 14 months. The dip kept dipping. The initial crash was a scratch compared to the amputation that followed. By November 2022, the crypto industry was a graveyard. Terra Luna had imploded. Three Arrows Capital had vanished. And then the Titan fell. FTX collapsed, dragging the price of Bitcoin down to $16,000. We are back in that dark room from the beginning. The president is staring at a portfolio that has been decimated. 60% of the investment is gone. The losses are staggering. $60 million of taxpayer money vaporized. The global media isn't just criticizing him anymore. They are writing his political obituary. The IMF is waiting with a bailout contract, ready to force him to his knees and strip the Bitcoin law from the books. The pressure to fold is absolute. The logical move, the only move left to save face, is to sell the remaining coins, salvage what's left, and beg for forgiveness. The world held its breath as he opened Twitter, waiting for the capitulation. He typed the characters. He hit send. "We are buying 1 Bitcoin every day starting tomorrow." He didn't blink. He stared into the abyss of financial ruin and decided to march straight into it. He wasn't just holding the bag. He was filling it up. That is a level of risk tolerance that either makes you a genius or a madman. If you want to see where this gamble leads, make sure you're subscribed because we are about to enter the volcano. But as the ink dried on that digital death wish, the bond market reacted with swift vengeance. The sharks weren't just circling anymore. They were taking bites out of the hull, and the headlines began to shift from mockery to a solemn preparation for a national default. The buy order was a scream into the void. The year 2023 didn't bring relief. It brought the suffocating silence of a financial winter. The headlines weren't just skeptical anymore. They were vicious. Every major publication in the Western world began drafting the autopsy report for El Salvador. They called it the folly of a dictator, a cautionary tale of what happens when you govern by meme rather than macroeconomics. The International Monetary Fund stopped hinting and started threatening. The message was binary: drop the Bitcoin law or starve. They shut the tap on lending, effectively blockading the country from the capital needed to pay pensions and pave roads. It was a diplomatic strangulation. But the real terror was on the bond market charts. The yields, the interest rate the country has to pay to borrow money, didn't just rise, they went parabolic, shattering the 30% ceiling. In the language of high finance, that number screams one thing: death. It meant the global markets had calculated a near-certain probability that El Salvador would default on its $800 million bond payment due in January. The country was officially classified as junk. Vulture funds began circling, preparing to buy up the nation's assets for pennies on the dollar once the inevitable collapse hit. On the ground, the dream seemed to be dissolving. The initial excitement of the $30 bonus had faded. The Chivo wallets, once opened daily, sat dormant on millions of phones. The people went back to cash. The stickers saying Bitcoin accepted here began to peel off the storefronts, faded by the tropical sun. It looked like the gamble had failed. The president appeared to be a captain lashed to the mast of a sinking ship, refusing to cut the rope while the water rose past his neck. The critics were so fixated on the red candles on the monitor that they thought the story was over. They thought the only value in this experiment was the price of the coin itself. They were looking at the bank accounts, convinced the coffers were empty. But while the world watched the surface freeze over, they missed what was happening beneath the crust. Deep in the jungle, miles away from the panic in the capital, heavy machinery was breaking ground on a project that sounded like science fiction. Bokel had realized that if he couldn't control the price of the asset, he had to control the creation of it. He was done buying. He was preparing to plug the national economy directly into the most terrifying, infinite power source nature had to offer. They tapped the vein of a monster. In the shadow of the Tecapa stratovolcano, engineers weren't drilling for oil or panning for gold. They were capturing the breath of the earth itself. Massive pipes snaked into the crust, funneling superheated steam at furious velocities to spin turbines that screamed day and night. But this power plant wasn't powering lights or toasters, and it was feeding a wall of computer servers contained in a shipping container, churning out trillions of cryptographic hashes per second. Bokel had changed the battlefield. He realized that if he couldn't control the volatile price of the currency, he would seize the means of its production. He was no longer just a speculator at the casino table. He was owning the printing press. Every 10 minutes, the volcano spat out fresh virgin Bitcoin, clean, green, and completely outside the jurisdiction of the Federal Reserve. But he needed more than just machines. He needed an army. The president pivoted his messaging, broadcasting a siren song to the maximalists, the die-hard believers who felt hunted by regulators in the West. He offered them a sanctuary. He slashed taxes on technology innovation to zero. No income tax, no capital gains tax. He was attempting a psychological transmutation, trying to scrub the bloodstains off El Salvador's reputation and repaint it as the Singapore of the West. He dangled a new financial instrument in front of the world, the volcano bond. $1 billion debt issuance backed not by dollars, but by the promise of this geothermal empire. It was a middle finger to the IMF, a declaration that he would raise capital from the internet crowd rather than the suits in Washington. Yet, for all the steam and the rhetoric, the numbers remained cold and unforgiving. The mining rigs were humming, but they were minting coins that were still worth half of what the country had paid for them. The debt maturity date was closing in like a sniper. The bond market was still pricing in a catastrophe. If the price of the asset didn't move, the volcano would just be a very expensive tombstone. For months, the line on the chart was a flat line. The bears were comfortable. The critics were writing the final drafts of their takedowns. The country was holding its breath, waiting for the default notification. Then, late in 2023, the corpse twitched. It started with a rumor on Wall Street, a whisper about a BlackRock ETF. The volume spikes began to hit the tape. The red candles turned green, then greener. The heartbeat of the market didn't just return. It began to race. And in the presidential palace, the notification screen lit up with a number that hadn't been seen in years. Then, the dam broke. January 2024. The United States Securities and Exchange Commission, after years of resistance, surrendered. The Bitcoin ETFs were approved. The floodgates of institutional capital swung open, and the chart went vertical. 20,000, 30,000, 40,000. The bears were slaughtered in their sleep. The crypto winter thawed into a violent spring. By March, the price shattered its old ceiling, ripping past $69,000 to print a new all-time high. Then, it kept going. 73,000, 100,000. In the presidential palace, the mood shifted from a funeral wake to a war room of vindication. The red ink on the screens vanished, replaced by a blinding green. The $60 million loss didn't just evaporate, it flipped into a profit of over $300 million. The portfolio was now worth north of $500 million. The bond market, which had priced the country for certain death, went silent. El Salvador didn't default. They paid their debts in full, with interest. The Wall Street vultures who had circled the carcass were forced to fly away hungry. Bukele took to X, not to celebrate, but to execute a digital drive-by. He reposted the articles predicting his ruin with a single emoji. The "I told you so" wasn't spoken, it was painted right in the face. The logical move was to cash out, take the win, secure the profit. But Bukele didn't sell. He didn't liquidate a single Satoshi. Instead, he made a move that was less like a central banker and more like a Bond villain. He announced that he was moving the bulk of the nation's hoard, over 5,000 coins, offline. They weren't just on a computer anymore, but he transferred them into a cold wallet, a digital vault disconnected from the internet, and physically locked it inside a secure facility within the national territory. He posted the address for the world to see, calling it the nation's piggy bank. He hadn't just made a trade, he had buried a treasure chest in the jungle, daring the world to come and take it. The vault is secure, but the streets remain unconvinced. While the president stares at a balance sheet glowing with unrealized gains, the average Salvadoran is still reaching for wrinkled paper bills. The digital revolution thundering from the palace has yet to bleed into the veins of the marketplace. The app downloads have stalled. The ATMs are quiet. It was a transformation ordered from the top down, a decree rather than a discovery. But perhaps the money was never the true prize. Bukele spent $100 million on a volatile asset, but he purchased $10 billion of global obsession. He took a nation defined by body counts and rebranded it as the Mecca of the future. He bought a billboard the size of the planet, yet the barrel is still spinning. Is this the blueprint for the forgotten nations of the global south to break their chains? Or is it a time bomb waiting for the next frost to shatter the fuse? Nayib Bukele played Russian roulette with his country's economy, and the gun clicked on an empty chamber. But in the casino of geopolitics, the house always wins eventually. The question is, when will he cash out? If you want a front row seat to the next financial revolution, check out this video on the screen right now. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the edge of the economy.